In this section, I will introduce an interface problem that concerns motor representation and intention. So I want you to imagine that you are strapped to a spinning wheel in some kind of James Bond style spy scenario, and you're about to be plunged to certain death. To your left there's a button, you could press the button. To your right there's a lever, you could probably just about reach that and pull the lever. With a flash of inspiration you form the following intention. You think to yourself, I will pull the lever. That's your intention. And sure enough, the motor representations kick into play, causing you first to reach, then to grasp, and finally to pull down that lever, narrowly saving your life. What's remarkable about this story is the fine match between the thing that you intend and the motor representations, which are then consequent on your intention. So what we know from this story and from the things we've been doing earlier is firstly that motor representations specify not only bodily configurations and joint displacements, but also much larger scale goals such as the reaching for, grasping and pulling of a lever. We also know that intentions specify goals such as the pulling of a lever as well. And what my little story about being strapped to the wheel and facing certain death is supposed to show is that there are actions which involve both intention and motor representation. And certainly any bodily action is just bound to involve motor representation. What we want is there to be a kind of match or harmony between the intentions and motor representations. It would be a fatal disaster for you if, upon intending to pull the lever, what actually happened was that your arm reached out and struck the button. That would be an absolute disaster. In that case, the outcomes represented motorically in you would not match the thing that you intend. Now we can be more precise about this notion of matching. I will say to you as a stipulation that two outcomes match in a particular context, just if in that context either the occurrence of one would normally constitute or cause the occurrence of the other, or conversely. And I take it that what we want to happen as much as possible is for there to be this kind of matching between our intentions and our motor representations so that we can escape the spinning wheel and exact an appropriate revenge on our former captor. Now it's important to see that this harmony, this matching between intentions and motor representations is not something to be taken for granted. And indeed Milipu and Pachauri mention three cases each of which very nicely illustrates a failure of match. The best known case and widely studied is the case of action slips that was extremely interesting to Freud and probably for that reason famous, and was studied even well before that. So there are a variety of examples of action slips that are interesting. You've already heard one in this recording. I intended to say intention and ended up saying attention. People likewise have been noted saying things like canpakes for pancakes. Got that right. And so that would be also an action slip. The intention specifies one outcome, the utterance of a particular word. The motor instructions specify a different outcome. And you notice with things like canpakes or attention instead of intention, it's not that things have just gone haywire. It's not like being, punched halfway through uttering a sentence so that you don't quite get the sounds right. There is clearly a sequence of coherent phonetic gestures which are being made. It's just not the phonetic gestures which match the intention. A more dramatic case reported by Norman, I think, you'll see that on the handout, is one of his students said, I was coming to the end of a dinner queue in the line and I reached into my pocket to take out a £5 note to pay. I knocked off some croutons, so I picked up the croutons from the salad intending to put the croutons into my mouth and the £5 note onto the cash desk, but I actually did the opposite. I put the note into my mouth and the croutons onto the cash desk. I'm sure we've all been there and done that kind of thing. The important thing about action slips from my point of view, they've played many interesting roles throughout philosophy, psychology, and a bit of psychiatry as well. The important thing from my point of view for action slips is to note that they show that there's no guarantee that the motor representations will match the intentions. Often enough, the two things are pulled apart for one reason or another, because the world affords certain actions and those affordances become irresistible. Because there is a slip, according to Milapu's more recent 2021 paper, in the attention as you are performing the action, or according to Norman, perhaps because their one action schema can be captured by another, more familiar one, and surely for many other reasons besides. A second illustration of how we can get a failure of matching between intentions and motor representations involves the pathological condition known as Ideomotor Apraxia. Ideomotor Apraxia. Another action slip there. I was starting on ideological when I went ideomotor. So Ideomotor Apraxia entails an inability to act on complex intentions, like the intention to post a letter through a slot or the intention to make some coffee, while all of the component actions are preserved. That's to say that people with ideomotor apraxia, it's a good thing this is about action slips, right? I'm not going to cut that. People with ideomotor apraxia are well able to perform the component actions, the reaching, grasping, positioning, moving and so on, that would be required for moving the letter through the slot or the coffee, and indeed in the right circumstances can demonstrate performance of all of the component actions, but are somehow unable to get the intention to do its ordinary work in performing the motor representation. So this is a disorder where we have a systematic failure to match. Another pathological case involving disorder is anarchic hand syndrome, often caused by damage to the SMA, supplementary motor area. And in anarchic hand syndrome, typically the hand contra to the lesion seems to, in some cases, have a life of its own. So Della Sala, for example, reports the case of a patient with anarchic hand syndrome who found themselves sitting opposite another person eating dinner together, and the anarchic hand would reach over and just take things from the other person's plate, which was, of course, contra to the intention that the person had. And what's particularly dramatic as an example of failure to match here is that with anarchic hand syndrome, because only one hand is performing the counter-intentional actions, it would be very hard to suggest that somehow the person does form the intention to take food from the other person's plate. That clearly would involve some kind of divided mind hypothesis, which is, I think, entirely unjustified by the actual scientific observations of the actual pathological disorder. Sometimes people will give you sort of dramatic examples about anarchic hand syndrome. Make sure that you always have a good source for a reputable peer-reviewed write-up of that particular anecdote if you're relying on it. Anarchic hand syndrome is probably a bit less dramatic than you think, but it does involve another case where what's represented motorically fails to match what is intended. So what I've been saying is that we cannot take for granted that intentions and motor representations will always match, although it's typically essential that they do. Failures of match are usually failures. So we have to ask this question, look, how is it that there are ever cases where the intentions and the motor representations match, and that isn't simply an accident? We've got the intention stuff going on, we've got the motor representation stuff going on. We know that they don't always match, we know that they sometimes do, we know that their sometimes matching is not an accident, or at least that's what we hope. And then the question is, well, look, how is that possible? Now, that's not yet a problem. That's simply a question. I think a problem is a question that's difficult to answer. What makes this question difficult to answer is that intention and motor representation are not inferentially integrated. So to see why this obstacle to answering the question makes it a problem. Consider the corresponding question. You have all of these desires, right? So you have a desire for ice cream, you have a desire for chocolate, but you can't, and a desire for, let's say, red wine. You can't really pursue all of those things together because it will end up being quite horrible. And in the end, you form, let's say, the intention to drink some of that red wine. Now, in this case, there is a match between your desires and your intention. It's not that you ended up forming the intention to eat broccoli, right? So the intention is coherent in the light of your desires. There's a match between the desires and the intention. When we ask in this case, how are the non-accidental matches possible? The answer presumably is that there is a process of practical reasoning, a kind of inferential process by which the various desires get, weighed up, and the beliefs about how likely it is that different actions will bring them about, how much effort would be involved, and so on, all feature in a process of practical reasoning, which, when things go well, result in intentions. So the non-accidental matching of desires and intentions is no mystery at all, because we can appeal to a process of practical reasoning. But the fact that intentions and motor representations are not inferentially integrated prevents us from taking that line. You also can see here that this is going to be problematic, because you know that in the case of action slips, it wasn't a failure of inference. There wasn't some kind of practical reasoning that was supposed to get you from the intention to the motor representation that didn't happen. Right? I don't think anybody thinks that this is a kind of case where there really ought to be inferential integration, and there wasn't. So we have a question, how a non-accidental match is possible, and that question is a problem because the natural, and I think probably the only way that until recently we've had at all of answering it, involves the idea of inferential integration. But in the case of intention and motor representation, we don't have that at all. That's not to say that there aren't now some attempts to solve the problem in the literature. It's just to say that all of those involve somewhat controversial moves, and I think everybody involved would likely agree that they haven't necessarily seen the full solution yet. We also can make a connection here with this notion of representational format that we came across earlier. If you accept the claim that intentions and motor representations differ in representational format, and I think you should, and you also think that representational format is a barrier to inferential integration, I think that's correct, then you have another way of establishing the failure of inferential integration. But I don't want to insist on that here, because I think that practically everybody can see that intentions and motor representations are not inferentially integrated in the way that, for example, desires and intentions are, and therefore the claim about the failure of inferential integration is more widely accepted than the claim about representational format. This then is the interface problem. The problem is to answer the question, how are non-accidental matches between intentions and motor representations ever possible?